Welcome life science learners to another installment. Trust that you guys are well and you're excited about our lesson today. In our lesson today, we're going to be focusing on revising the human reproductive system with a special focus on the male and female parts, and then we're going to move on to looking at some of the hormonal controls during menstruation and ovulation. It's important that when we revise content that we look at the core concepts that are related to any topic. And these are essentially your checkpoints so that you have a good understanding of what needs to be completed and studied in this section. That's what we're going to do, and then we're going to look at some structures and parts and their functions. Let's get straight into the lesson. So we're going to review some of the concepts, and we're going to look at an overview of the male and female reproductive systems in this segment. Our core concepts, as I mentioned, are important in that we should know exactly what we need to prepare and study for. It's important that you know the structure of the male and female reproductive system. We must understand what the changes that occur at puberty and what are the hormones that are associated with puberty, as well as the process of gametogenesis and gamete formation. So structure of male and female, again, we must know what puberty is and the hormones that stimulate puberty, as well as the production of gametes, which was in terms of at puberty, we looked at gametogenesis and we looked at spermatogenesis and ovulation and those concepts. We also need to look at the process of the menstrual cycle, the concept of fertilization and what happens after that, and the development of the zygote to the blastocyst. We also spend some time looking at the process of implantation as well as the gestation period and the role of the placenta. And then finally, you should end up revising through the concept of what contraception is, the different methods of contraceptive measures that are taken, as well as probably the treatment of infertility, or what does fertility mean. So that's an overview of the key concepts that you need to revise when planning or when studying for the section on human reproduction. As an overview, when we look at the male and female reproductive systems, it's important that first you understand the concepts based on a diagram. So draw some diagrams or print out some diagrams. Keep these as illustrations that you can very quickly refer to when you revise for an assessment. Know the parts. You should be able to identify all the parts that are on a diagram. And if it helps, label these, highlight them so that they stand out. It's important that you understand what these parts are and what are the structures that are important in terms of each of these organs functioning. And then you need to know the functions of each of these structures, because these often are a way to remember how an organ functions. So understanding the diagram, labeling the parts, and having a sense of what these structures are and their functions. So those are the kind of the basic concepts that you would need to understand when looking at the male and female reproductive systems. Now let's look at both of these systems and we'll have an overview of them. It's important that when we look at the male reproductive system, we understand the view that we're looking at. So for me, this is the side view that I've illustrated to you. And as a recap, we've got to go through these parts, and we know that there is obviously the glands that produce them, and I often start with the testes, and the testes are housed in a sac called the scrotum, and the significance of that is important in us understanding why they are outside the body. We know that on the surface of the testes are these coiled tubes, and we refer to that as the epididymis, and these are then the organs that produce the sperms, and then the sperms are transferred via a tube called the vas deferens, where that then enters into the ejaculatory duct, and then it is released via the urethra, which is that tube there, and that carries both semen as well as urine out. We also know that there are three glands that are important, and these are the Cowper's gland, the seminal vesicle, as well as the prostate gland. And these three glands, we should know the significance of them in terms of what secretions are produced and how they collectively contribute to the production of semen. It's important that we understand that we have foreskin at the tip of the penis, and that the penis contains erectile tissue, which fills up with blood upon stimulation and becomes stiff and erect. Okay, the significance of the scrotum is important as a structure that houses the testes slightly below body temperature. And so that's a very quick overview of the parts. Again, make sure that you remember the functions of each part and you're able to label a diagram like this. So we're going to try that in a little while. As an overview of the female reproductive system, we've got to have a sense of what the female reproductive system is made up of. So we have a pair of ovaries, and you'll see them right here, these almond-shaped structures, which are then producing the eggs, which are then carried via these fallopian tubes, and that's the equivalent of the sperm duct, or in the males, and here we have that in females called the fallopian tubes, and these carry the eggs to the muscular organ called the uterus, and the uterus is lined on the internal side by the endometrium. Again, it's made up of a muscle layer called the myometrium. You've got to have context to what the cervix is, the opening, and that's the opening between the uterus and the vagina here. You've got to remember that you also have the bladder that's situated just in front of the uterus. Okay, so that's the overview of the female reproductive system. So we must know the organs that produce the eggs, the tubes that carry the eggs to the uterus, and the cervix as the opening that connects the vagina to the uterine chamber. Again, know the structure, the different parts, and their respective functions. Now, having looked at the overview, let's try and have a sense of how these questions can be asked in the context of a revision-based assessment. So here's a question. The diagrams below show the human male and female reproductive systems. And so these systems are illustrated alongside each other with different parts that are labeled. I often look at a diagram and very quickly try and identify the parts. And so the key to answering a question successfully is often parts are labeled. And the reason why they're labeled is obviously the examiner is going to reference those labeled parts at some point. So the overview of a diagram is to look at a diagram and to very quickly pencil in some of those parts that are labeled. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do very quickly. So we have the male reproductive system situated on the left-hand side, and structure A points to these tubes that are carrying the sperm out. So that would be the vas deferens. Okay, so that's the vas deferens there. If you look at structure B points to the tube that carries out semen along with sperm. So that's the urethra, and that's the urethra. Structure C points to the testes that we can easily identify, and structure D points to the penis. Okay, so that's obviously the male reproductive systems that we've labeled very quickly. When we look at the female reproductive system, we can see that we've got E, which points to the tubes that carry up the eggs towards the uterine chamber, and that's the fallopian tubes, or if you mention the oviducts, that would be correct. We've got the structure F, which points to the ovary, and that's the organ that produces the ova. Structure G points to the uterine membrane or layer here, and that could be the uterus, or if you mention the myometrium, that would be correct. And structure H points to the vagina. So that's a very quick summary of being able to label the parts in the male and female reproductive systems. Okay, so again, a few questions that we'll try and wrap this section up with. So which transports sperm out of the body? So we've got to point to which part transports sperms out of the body. And if we look at the male reproductive system, we know that sperms are produced here in the testes, and they are transported out of the body via this tube here. So that is the urethra. So the answer there is B. Okay. The next question. Where does ovulation occur? So name the structure or letter where ovulation occurs. Now the concept of ovulation is the process where an ovum is released from the ovary, and that's around day 14. So again, we've got to look at the structure where the ovulation occurs, and that takes place right here at structure F, which is the ovary. And remember that around day 14 that the Graafian follicle will release an ovum, and that then enters the fallopian tube and moves along the fallopian tube. And finally, which structure houses the fertilized egg? So guys, remember that fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. So this is where fertilization occurs. So the fertilization process occurs in structure E. But the question is, which structure houses the fertilized egg? Remember that in terms of after fertilization, you'll find that the egg, which is now formed the zygote, is housed in the uterus. So that would be structure G. So again, to recap, it's key that you understand the difference between the word housing and the word in terms of the process of fertilization. So in this case, it's the area in which this fertilized egg is actually going to be housed and developed. So guys, that's been an overview of this section where we've looked at a quick overview of the male and female reproductive systems. We've labeled some of these parts, and what we tried to do was attempt a few questions based on a simple diagram that was there. So I trust that you guys have now recollected the structures for the male and female reproductive systems. I think it's important that we have a little break. When we get back, we'll tackle a few more questions on the male and female reproductive system. So have a little stretch break, and I'll see you guys in a little while. Welcome back, life science learners, to the next segment. We've just looked at an overview of the male and female reproductive systems. Let's continue with our revision lesson on the male and female reproductive systems. In this segment, we're going to try a few more questions and try and hone in on the application of our understanding of both the male and female reproductive systems. So let's get straight into the lesson. I've got a few questions that we can work through, and I trust that while we do this, that you think about these answers and you're able to respond in your heads or write down, so that when we discuss these, that you kind of had an opportunity to test yourself while this happens. So again, here's a question that we're going to look at. The question reads, indicate whether each of these statements in column 1 applies to A only, B only, both A and B, or none of the items in column 2. Right? A only, B only, both A and B, or none next to the question number. So guys, these questions often come up in the first section of your exam paper, and they often are easy questions but can be very confusing, because as I mentioned, each of these questions have 4 possible options. So you have to write either A only, B, AB, or none of them. So this means that it does become a bit more confusing, that you've got to consider 4 options for each answer. And so this will test a thorough understanding of concepts or terminology, and hence you've got to spend some time reading through these carefully to ensure that you're not giving an answer that is wrong because you've rushed through it or you've misinterpreted the question. So let's read with a highlighter if you have one, and highlight the key concepts in the question so that it makes it easier for us to be able to establish what the answer is. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next slide, and I've enlarged in that for you. So column 1, the first question, the tube leading from the testes to the urethra in males. So guys, if we go back and reflect on the male reproductive system, the tube that leads from the testes to the urethra would be the tube that carries out from the epididymis, all the way up to the ejaculatory duct, and that's the vas deferens or the sperm duct. Okay, so let's look at the options that are given in column 2. So vas deferens, correct, as I mentioned, and the second option B is the seminiferous tubules. So guys, if we recollect where the seminiferous tubules are, these are tubules that you find within the testes, and it is in these tubules that the process of spermatogenesis occurs, or the division and production of the sperm cells. So it's certainly not B, but it's definitely A. So the answer here is A only. And so remember that we've got to illustrate exactly the way the question requires us to respond. So it's A only. Well done if you've got that. The next term in column 1, is the birth canal. Now guys, the birth canal refers to the passage through which the baby passes during a normal natural vaginal delivery. So let's look at that concept. So we've got 2 options here, and we know that the birth canal is from the uterus into the vagina. And so let's look at what options are given. In column 2 we have the uterus, and the urethra. Certainly not the urethra. However, if you're thinking about the uterus, remember that the question says birth canal. And so the uterus is the structure in which the baby develops during gestation. So it's certainly not the uterus, and hence in this, none of these are correct. And so we've got to illustrate clearly that none of these options are correct. The next question is tube that releases semen from the male. So again, it's the tube that releases the semen from the male. So guys, the options that are given here are the ureter and the urethra. Now, if you go back to recollecting what the ureters were, and these are the structures that carry urine from the kidney all the way to the bladder. So that's the urethra or the ureters, and these are not correct. However, the tube that carries the semen out of the body along with urine is called the urethra. So the answer here is B only. Okay. The next question, number 4. Hormone that stimulates. So it's a hormone that stimulates the development of secondary sexual characteristics in males. And we were chatting about this earlier on, and we said that puberty is influenced by the hormone testosterone in males. So if we look at it, FSH, that stimulates the development of the sperm cells. So it's not linked with actually the development of secondary sexual characteristics, but it is the hormone testosterone that is linked to the development of male characteristics at puberty. And so the answer here would be B only. Okay, well done if you got that. Let's look at the 5th part. The part of the female reproductive system where fertilization takes place. So guys, the process of fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. So after ovulation, when the egg enters into the fallopian tube, you'll find that a sperm that may have entered the body will fertilize with that egg in the fallopian tube. So it's the fallopian tube in which this process occurs. So the cervix is the opening between the vagina and the uterus, and so it's certainly not that, but it's definitely the fallopian tube, and we have the option B only come up again. So well done if you were able to get these. As I said, it does take a little while, and it's important that you read these options carefully and understand that you're making the correct decision and not a rushed decision. Okay, let's continue with a few more questions on the male and female reproductive system. The diagram below represents a cross-sectional view. So this is a cross-sectional view of the human seminiferous tubule in which spermatogenesis is occurring. Study the diagram and answer the questions that follow. So guys, just to give you context, again, we're referring to the seminiferous tubules. If I help you recollect the seminiferous tubules, if we take a section through the testes, we've got these lobes, and in these lobes we've got several coil tubes. And so these coil tubes are the tubes in which spermatogenesis occurs. So these tubes have been cut into a cross section. So we're taking one of these tubes and we're looking at it in a cross section. So that's essentially what we're looking at in this diagram. So we're looking at a cross section through the seminiferous tubules showing the process of spermatogenesis. And essentially this process shows you the development from these germinal epithelial cells, which are right here on the lining of the seminiferous tubules, to the process of them developing to becoming young spermatids to fully developed sperm cells there. So this is, again, as I mentioned, this is all happening within the seminiferous tubules. Let's look at the questions based on this. Again, here, a larger view of that, and if I were to complete this, that is what the seminiferous tubule would look like, and there's an adjacent seminiferous tubule there. And so this process that is occurring here is the production of your sperm cells, which we see right here at the bottom from your germinal epithelial lining of the seminiferous tubules. Let's look at question 1. Name the hormone produced by the cells of Leydig. Now if we go to the diagram and if we look at the Leydig cells, a little earlier on we looked at hormones responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics as well as the production of sperm cells. So it would be these cells called the Leydig cells. In some books it's referred to as the interstitial cells. Interstitial meaning cells between the seminiferous tubules. So in this diagram, the hormone produced by these Leydig cells is testosterone. And so the testosterone is produced by these cells that then enter into the seminiferous tubules, stimulating the process of spermatogenesis or sperm formation. Okay, so that is testosterone. Question 2. Name one function of the hormone mentioned in question 1. So what are the functions of testosterone? We know that testosterone is important in maintaining male characteristics. It also stimulates the development of sperm. At puberty, testosterone is responsible for the development of secondary sexual characteristics. And so you can mention 3 possible functions of testosterone. So that's important for you to understand, is that testosterone has several functions in terms of muscle development, growth of pubic hair, body hair, the deepening of the voice. So those are all associated with the development of secondary sexual characteristics. So try not to give 2 functions that are similar, so in the sense that the secondary sexual characteristics, but give one that relates to puberty and the other in terms of the general function of testosterone being linked to sperm formation. Right, so more questions on this. How many chromosomes are in each of the following? So guys, this takes us back to the process of spermatogenesis as well as linking that to meiosis. So if we look at the spermatogonium cell, and that's illustrated here, we know that during the process of spermatogenesis, a single cell divides, undergoes series of divisions to form 4 cells. And these 4 cells are your spermatids or your sperm cells. So if we were to look at the number of chromosomes in these cells, and if you look quite carefully into these diagrams, it shows you the processes of meiosis occurring. So these cells are generally your diploid cells, which undergo first meiotic division to give you 2 haploid cells, which in turn divide to produce 4 cells that are each haploid. And so if we look at a human cell, a human diploid cell should have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. So that cell would have 23 pairs, and the next cell, the spermatid here, if you look at them, these that are produced at the end would be these cells here. So they would be haploid cells, and in the context of a human haploid cell, that would have 23 single chromosomes and not pairs. So these would be 23 chromosomes. Okay, so it's important that you link your understanding of meiosis to these questions, especially with regards to the number of chromosomes that occur in these cells at different stages of development. Explain the importance of spermatogenesis as a mechanism to introduce variation by referring to prophase 1 and metaphase 1. So guys, in this question here, you got to refer to meiosis. And if you recollect, in meiosis, there's a lot of variation that is brought about. And that variation happens, as we pointed out, in prophase 1. And so the key concept of prophase 1 is that crossing over occurs. And we saw that the homologous pairs lie next to each other with the inner chromatids exchanging genetic information. And that process is referred to as crossing over. And that produces variation in the resulting gametes at the end of meiosis 2. So in prophase 1, we know that crossing over occurs, and that is the variation that we see in the gametes. In metaphase 1, guys, if we recollect at metaphase 1, we know that there is this imaginary equator, and along the equator we find the homologous pairs of chromosomes meeting, and they meet in a very independent fashion. So we talk about the arrangement of chromosomes along the equator being independent, and so we refer to that as independent assortment. And so these chromosomes arrange themselves independently, and that allows for significant variation when they move apart during anaphase 1. And it's important that you understand this as a significant process in producing variation. So as we wrap this segment up, we mentioned that it's in prophase 1, and we refer to the process of crossing over, which produces the variation in the chromatids, and we see that variation present in the gametes. As I mentioned, in metaphase 1, the homologous pairs will meet along the equator, and these are randomly arranged. And so that process of random assortment occurs when chromosomes are going to be moved apart during anaphase 1. So guys, collectively, we've got to be able to link processes like meiosis to spermatogenesis and oogenesis. So guys, that's a wrap for this question. Let's see if we can get on to more revision in the next bit. Welcome back, life science learners, to the next part of our lesson today. In our lesson, we're going to continue focusing on revision of the human reproductive system. In this segment, we're going to focus on the menstrual cycle and the ovulation and the hormones associated with that. Let's look at the menstrual cycle and ovulation and hormones that are responsible for controlling these processes. The graphs showing the relationship between the ovarian and uterine cycles as well as hormone levels during each cycle are presented on the next slide. So as we look at these graphs, it shows you the level of hormones and various processes occurring. So guys, the best way to remember and revise this section is using a graph like this, because this is a comprehensive graph that shows you various structures and processes occurring along with the processes that occur over a period of time. So I often remind the learners at school to refer to these graphs and use this as a consolidation of all of that process. So there are various processes indicated along the y-axis. We'll refer to that in a bit, but it's important that we understand what is on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, we've got the duration of the cycle from day 0 or day 1 all the way to day 28, with the midpoint being day 14 here. And this shows you various structures and it gives you a sense of what has happened over the first 14 days and then over the next 14 days. If we look right on the top, it shows you the development of structures within the ovary, so we refer to that as the ovarian cycle, and this points out the development of the primary follicle all the way developing into a mature grafton follicle, and then the process of ovulation where an ova is released. Let's look at a bigger version of this graph. If we look right on the top and we look at the y-axis and we look at various structures indicated along that, and this essentially shows you the ovarian cycle. So essentially what is happening within the ovary. And it's important that we recognize that within the ovary we have the follicle that's developing, and that develops from a primary follicle all the way into a mature grafton follicle, which takes around 14 days, and we find the process of ovulation occurring here, which is indicated there. All of these are influenced by hormones, which we would look at in a little while. And then obviously, over the next 14 days, we see the development of the corpus luteum, which is then maintained for the rest of that 14 days, all up until day 28. Further down, there's also an indication of the body temperature, and what's unique about body temperature is that just before ovulation, we see an increase in the body temperature. And this is approximately 1.5 degrees, where the body temperature increases slightly above normal body temperature, and that is maintained for the rest of that 14 days, and then you find that when the next cycle begins, the temperature drops. Further down, we see the pituitary hormones, and these hormones are the two hormones released from the pituitary gland, which was FSH and LH. And so it's important that we understand that the release of FSH stimulates the development of that follicle. So the light blue line that we're looking at stimulates the development of the follicle, and it's important that we recognize that around this period, around day 12, we find that there's a rapid increase in the other pituitary hormone called LH, and that is linked to, again, the process of ovulation. Further down, we look at the ovarian hormones. So these are the hormones produced from the ovary. There are two hormones that are produced from the ovary, guys, estrogen and progesterone. So we know that as the follicle develops, we see that there's an increase in the estrogen levels, and then once ovulation takes place, we see there's a rapid increase in the other hormone, progesterone levels. And so we find there's a decrease around estrogen at day 14, and that's got to do with the digression or the rupturing of the grafton follicle, but we see that LH level tends to continue, and that is stimulated by the corpus luteum. Right at the bottom, we see a graph illustrating the thickness. So this is a measure of the thickness of the endometrium, and the first bit shows you the thinning of that, or the shredding away of that, and that is referred to as menstruation. And then further on we see the thickening of that, and then we see how that is maintained over the next 14 days. And so we refer to that being maintained by the hormone progesterone. So guys, it's important that you see the interdependence between the various structures, the various processes, and how they are linked to each other over the 28-day cycle. So having done that, let's take a few questions on this, and let's see if we can understand the applications of this in a better way. Right, so the graph below shows the levels of hormones, estrogen and progesterone in a pregnant woman. And that's important that we recognize that the question refers to a pregnant woman. And so we know that pregnancy is maintained by the level of progesterone, and that's something that you must always remember. And so during pregnancy, there's no ovulation. So it means that we find that the endometrium now needs to be maintained. There's no menstruation, there's no ovulation as well. So these are the key things that you've got to remember about being pregnant. So let's look at what happens over the next 28 days. So we know that the average cycle is about 28 days. We see that initially the units of these hormones are illustrated in arbitrary units, and these are hormones that are produced from day 1 all the way up until day 14. And we find that estrogen, which is indicated in the dark blue line, tends to increase around day 14, and that's we mentioned, and then decreases because of the release of the Graafian follicle releasing the ovum that causes the rupturing of that. But what we note is that after the corpus luteum forms, there's an increase in progesterone levels. Okay, having noted that the woman is pregnant, we notice that at day 28, the level of progesterone will continue to remain high. If this was a lady that was not pregnant, you would have noticed that there would have been a decrease in that. So that's an interesting question that we're going to look at. So when are the levels of estrogen and progesterone the same? And that's again referring to the graph. So let's point out to the graph. So if we look at the levels of estrogen and progesterone, there are 2 points where these lines intersect. The one point is here, and the other point is here. I know that many of you will probably go with this because that's the more distinct point, and that's around day 17. But it's important that we also recognize that there is a point here where they do intersect, and that's around day 7 or day 6.5. So we're seeing 2 points at which they intersect, and I'm sure that you'll be given the benefit of that if you used both day 17 as well as day 6.5 or day 7. Okay, how much estrogen is in the blood on day 14? Again, guys, around day 14, we've got to be able to use our rulers and extrapolate. And the hormone we're referring to is estrogen. So if you go up all the way to estrogen, you've got to use your ruler and extrapolate that. And that's around 33 units. And so it's important that we recognize what unit is given. And here it refers to arbitrary units, but we'll give that arbitrary units as a measure of unit. Okay, so guys, that's an overview of this section. We've looked at the hormones. We've tried to interact with graphs and see how the interrelatedness occurs. This was a short question on some of these hormones. You guys have a little break, and when we get back, we will tackle more questions on these hormones in the menstrual and the ovulation cycles. Quick break, and I'll see you back in a little while. Welcome back, Life Science learners, to our final segment for today. We've been looking at a revision lesson on human reproduction with a special focus on the menstrual and the ovarian cycles. Let's continue trying to understand how we can better improve the understanding of these concepts. In our next bit, we've got to look at some terminology, and then we'll take some questions that require a bit more in-depth understanding. Right. So, provide the correct biological terms for the following statements. And guys, the best way to revise any section is to have a terminology list. And I often tend to, encourage the learners that I teach to create a list of terms at the beginning of your notes and write those terms down. And so those can be a quick reference that you have in terms of when revising this section. So this part of the segment will actually help us to recollect some of those terms that you would have made a list of as you started this section. So the first concept, the release of ripe ovum from the ovary of a female mammal. So guys, when an ovum is released from the ovary, we refer to that process as ovulation. And we notice that in the cycles that we illustrated early on in humans, ovulation is linked to the release of high amounts of FSH, and that will stimulate the production of the follicle. And around day 14, LH peaks, and that process is stimulated by the hormone LH. The next question, the remainder of the Graafian follicle after fertilization in the female ovary. So what happens after fertilization is that when ovulation occurs, the Graafian follicle ruptures and then an ovum is released. But we know that that Graafian follicle then becomes a structure known as the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is what's remaining, or the new structure that is formed after the process of ovulation. So the question there, the answer to that would be the corpus luteum. Question number 3. The hollow organ in mammals in which the embryo develops. Again, the word develops. So the embryo, remember, implants within the uterine lining, and it's the uterus in which all of this development or gestational development occurs. So the answer to that question would be the uterus. Let's move on to a few more on this. The diploid cell in the follicle of the ovary, which forms the ovum after meiosis. So again, the diploid cell in the follicle of the ovary. So this would be pointing to the primary follicle, and that is what develops and will become what we refer to as the ovum, or release an ovum around ovulation. Question number 5. The monthly cyclic secretion of blood and the lining of the uterus when fertilization has not occurred. So again, the cyclic events of the release of blood and endometrial tissue when fertilization has not occurred is referred to as the process of menstruation. And menstruation generally happens between days 1 to about day 6, or even 5, 6, or 7. So that's the average time that it takes for the process of menstruation to occur. Okay, a few more on terms. The hormone produced by the pituitary gland that causes the maturing of the follicle surrounding the oocyte and stimulates the supply of nutrients. So again, a mouthful. So let's go back to it. So it's the hormone that we need to identify that is produced by the pituitary gland that causes the maturing of the follicle surrounding the oocyte. So guys, remember that there are two hormones produced by the pituitary gland. The one hormone is FSH and the other is LH. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and the other is the luteinizing hormone. So if you remember that the follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of the primary follicle, it would be FSH. That would be the correct answer. If you're confused between LH, remember that LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and that targets the corpus luteum, which obviously develops post-ovulation. So that would be after day 14. So the answer to this question is FSH. Question 7, the process by which the haploid egg cells or ova are produced in the follicles of the ovary. So that process in which the haploid egg cells are produced is called oogenesis. And so that is meiosis, where eggs are produced, called oogenesis. Question 8. A hormone produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, so the pituitary gland, that stimulates the release of estrogen in the bloodstream that causes ovulation. Okay? So again, the hormone that stimulates ovulation, as I mentioned earlier on, is called luteinizing hormone, or LH. And that is the hormone that targets the Graafian follicle, causing it to rupture, releasing an ovum. Question number 9. A hormone secreted by the ovaries causing ovulation. Okay? So again, secreted by the ovaries, the hormone that's secreted by the ovaries causing ovulation would be high levels of progesterone. Okay, so that would be progesterone. Finally, question 10. The hormone secreted by the corpus luteum when the egg cell or the ovum is fertilized to ensure pregnancy. So the corpus luteum stimulates the ovary to produce progesterone. And progesterone is the hormone that actually maintains the lining of the endometrium in case fertilization has occurred. So the hormone here would be, when fertilization does occur, would be progesterone that would maintain the lining and maintain the levels of progesterone in the blood. So guys, that's a wrap of this question where we've spent some time looking at some difficult concepts. And as I mentioned, these can be very confusing. And I think it's important that you read the question well and you're able to refer to a list of terms that you've written down to have a very quick access to these. The next question. Study the diagram below showing the sequence of events of the development of the ovum in a 28-day cycle. So here is obviously an enlarged diagram showing you the ovum, and this is the context to where the ovum is. And if we were to draw in the fallopian tubes, the fallopian tubes would be here, and that would be the fimbriae. So this is the context of where the ovary is, and this is pointing to various structures that are developing in the ovary. So here, if you look at it, you've got the primary follicle developing, and that's the direction of development. Here we have a mature Graafian follicle that develops, and we're seeing a process here where an oocyte or an ovum is released, and we see that process continuing towards here. So that's the starting point here. That's the midpoint here around where we know that ovulation occurs, and then finally we see the degeneration of that corpus luteum occurring here. So again, a typical ovary that we see often in a question. Let's look at what questions are based on this. So the first question is identify the following. Follicle labeled A. And if we go to that diagram, guys, follicle labeled A points to this structure that is developing, and that's the Graafian follicle. And we know that the Graafian follicle is that structure that develops and releases an oocyte around day 14. So it's the Graafian follicle that we have developing. Okay. The next question is identify structure labeled C. And if we go to C, C is indicated right here, and structure C is essentially what happens to the corpus luteum or the Graafian follicle after ovulation is that it forms the corpus luteum. So that would be a dead follicle called the corpus luteum, and we can clearly see that there. And its function is linked to the production of progesterone from the ovary after ovulation. Process B shown, or the process shown here at B would be that process where we clearly see the release of an ovum around this structure here. So that's the mature Graafian follicle that has ruptured, and that's the ovum that is released. And that process we refer to as is ovulation. So ovulation is the release of an oocyte around day 14. We've got to identify the following. Hormone responsible for the formation of part A. If we look at part A, guys, the formation of that Graafian follicle is stimulated by a pituitary hormone. And if you remember the word follicle, its stimulation is due to a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. So the hormone responsible for that is called FSH, and it's released from the pituitary gland. The next question would be, we've got to identify the hormone responsible for the formation of part C. So part C is the corpus luteum, and if we look at the pituitary gland, it produces two hormones, FSH and LH. So FSH, we mentioned, targets the primary follicle, stimulating its development. However, LH is responsible for maintaining the structure here called the corpus luteum. So the hormone that is responsible for the formation of part C is called luteinizing hormone. Again, corpus luteum stimulates is stimulated by luteinizing hormone. Great stuff. Let's look at the next part of this question. What type of cell division resulted in the formation of part D? Guys, again, we're linking this again to meiosis and hormones, which is the endocrine. So we know that part D is the ovum, and that process of ovum formation is linked to a process of meiosis called oogenesis. And so that is meiosis, where oogenesis produces part D, which is the ovum. Question 3. State whether fertilization took place in this 28-day cycle. Now guys, often this question is based on a graph that illustrates the levels of progesterone. And we know that when the levels of progesterone remain high post day 28, we could infer that there is a possibility that fertilization has occurred. However, here we presented with the ovary, and we notice that towards the latter part, let's look at post-ovulation. So we can assume that if fertilization takes place, we know that the corpus luteum will remain intact. However, this image shows you the degeneration of the corpus luteum. And so if we assume that fertilization had taken place, we would have had to have seen the corpus luteum being maintained throughout the next trimester. And that is important because the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone, which actually maintains the lining of the endometrium, ensuring that when implantation takes place, that implantation is maintained until the placenta develops. So this would be obviously the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which would indicate that there was no fertilization that took place here, and hence I can infer that because of the corpus luteum degenerating, there was no fertilization that took place. Okay, so explain your answer to the question. That's essentially, as I mentioned, because there is a degeneration in the size of the corpus luteum, one could infer that no fertilization has taken place. Because we know that when fertilization does take place, the corpus luteum needs to be maintained, and that continues to produce progesterone, which clearly is not indicated in this image. Right. So let's move on to the next part of this question. Explain how and why the production of FSH is inhibited when fertilization takes place. Now guys, if we remember that FSH is a hormone that is produced by the pituitary gland to stimulate the development of a new follicle. So the question points explain how and why the production of FSH is inhibited. So the simple rationale for this question is FSH needs to be inhibited because we now have fertilization taking place. When fertilization takes place, it means that an egg will now continue its development within the endometrium. So the need for a new formation of a new egg is not there, and hence the pituitary gland will not be able to produce a new egg. And that is because when fertilization occurs, we know that this structure called the corpus luteum remains intact. And so the corpus luteum will then stimulate high levels of progesterone. High levels of progesterone in turn have a negative feedback mechanism on the pituitary gland, meaning that the pituitary gland will not produce FSH. And this in turn will mean that the levels of FSH decrease significantly. Considering that fact, it's important that we also recognize that this is the concept that we use, or that is being used in many contraceptive pills that female may take to avoid conception. So that is based on that these pills contain levels of progesterone and estrogen that suppress the pituitary gland from producing a new egg. So essentially suppressing the levels of FSH so that no egg is produced and no ovulation occurs. And that's the rationale for that question. Okay, so guys, we obviously have looked at the various hormones. We've looked at the interactions between the various structures. In our next question, we would have discussed this. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of this segment. But before we wrap up, it's important that we have an overview of what we looked at. So we've looked at the male and female reproductive systems. We've looked at the menstrual cycle and the processes occurring during in the ovary, such as ovulation and menstruation. It's important that we remember the two hormones FSH and LH produced from the pituitary gland, and we remember that the ovarian hormones progesterone and estrogen are significantly important in maintaining the thickness of the endometrium. Guys, you've been a fantastic audience. I trust that you've benefited from this revision lesson. Go back to your drawing boards, look at the male and female reproductive systems, draw these diagrams out, label them, learn their structures and their functions, and don't forget to refer to this graph. Probably the most important graph in summarizing a total understanding of this section. You've been a great audience, guys. Hope you have enjoyed the lesson. See you soon. Have a baie lekker day. Cheers.